The Zero fighter plane vibrated so violently that the instrument panel was a blur, 3,000 feet above the dark Pacific Ocean. Inside the cockpit, the air was thin and smelled of gasoline and sweat. Seiichi Miyazaki stared at the fuel gauge. The needle was dropping. It was designed to drop. It was never meant to be refilled. He was 22 years old, and he was already dead. Technically, his funeral had already happened back at the base. He was a ghost piloting a bomb. His orders were simple: find an American aircraft carrier, dive, die. But as he looked through the rain-streaked canopy, he saw nothing but gray fog and endless water. No enemy ships, no targets, just the cold realization that he was alone in the sky. He had a choice to make in the next 60 seconds. He could crash into the ocean and die for nothing, disappearing under the waves without scratching the enemy. Or he could turn the plane around. If he turned around, he would survive the flight. But on the ground, a firing squad would be waiting. In the Empire of Japan in 1945, returning alive was a crime worse than treason. If you enjoy discovering these forgotten moments of history, please take a quick second to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring these stories to light. Seiichi gripped the stick, his knuckles white. He looked at the dark ocean one last time. Then he banked the wings. He was going back to hell. It was July 1945. The war was already lost, though no one in Japan was allowed to say it aloud. The special attack units, known to the world as the Kamikaze, were the last desperate gamble. Young men, often university students with barely enough training to take off, were being hurled at the massive American fleet approaching the mainland. The propaganda called them falling cherry blossoms. Beautiful, ephemeral, heroes who shattered like crystal. But the reality was grime, fear, and mechanical failure. Seiichi Miyazaki was not a fanatic. He was a student drafted from his university. He loved literature. He had a family. But the military machine had processed him, stripped him of his individuality, and placed him in the cockpit of a Mitsubishi Zero loaded with 250 kilograms of explosives. According to his later memoirs, the atmosphere at the base was suffocating. He wrote, "We were told that death was lighter than a feather, but duty was heavier than a mountain. But up in the air, death just felt cold." The morning of the mission had been a blur of ritual. The toast of sake, the tying of the hachimaki headband, the final salute, the roar of engines drowning out the cicadas screaming in the trees. The air was humid and heavy. He remembered the face of his commanding officer, a man with eyes like flint. The officer had leaned into the cockpit just before the canopy closed. "Do not return," the officer had said. "Do not shame your ancestors." "I will not," Seiichi had replied. The engine roared to life, spitting blue smoke. He took off into a sky that was already turning the color of a bruise. Storm clouds were gathering over the flight path. Formation flying was difficult even for veterans. For a hastily trained student pilot, it was a nightmare. 10 minutes into the flight, the visibility dropped to 0. Rain lashed against the glass. The formation broke apart. He lost sight of his wingman. He lost sight of the leader. He was flying blind in a white void. He checked his compass, but the turbulence threw the plane around like a toy. He dropped altitude, hoping to spot the American fleet under the cloud layer. Nothing. Just white caps on a churning ocean. He circled. He waited. The fuel gauge continued its steady march toward empty. He knew the logic. A kamikaze pilot carries only enough fuel for a one-way trip to the target area. If he stayed here, he would run dry. He would fall into the sea. It would be a dog's death, meaningless and unseen. His heart hammered against his ribs. He remembered a line he wrote in his diary just days before. "I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of dying for nothing." He looked at the fuel gauge again. He had enough to get back to the airfield. Barely. But the officer's voice echoed in his headset, even though the radio was silent. "Do not return." To return was to admit failure. To return was to be branded a coward. Cowards were beaten. Cowards were shunned. And in the final days of the war, cowards were executed to maintain morale. Seiichi made the turn. The flight back was agonizing. Every mile felt like he was flying toward a guillotine. The clouds began to break just as the outline of the Japanese coast appeared. The island looked peaceful from above. Green mountains, white beaches. It didn't look like a nation burning to the ground. He lowered the landing gear. The mechanical thud sounded like a judge's gavel. As he lined up with the runway, he saw figures running on the tarmac. They weren't cheering. They were confused. A kamikaze plane was not supposed to come back. The wheels touched the dirt. The plane bounced, then settled. He taxied to a stop near the hangars. He cut the engine. The propeller spun down to a halt. Silence. Absolute silence. Then, the sound of boots running on gravel. Seiichi unbuckled his harness. His legs felt like lead. He pushed the canopy open and climbed out onto the wing. The ground crew stood in a circle, staring up at him. They looked like they were seeing a ghost. Or a monster. An officer pushed through the crowd. He was red-faced, his sword clattering against his hip. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask about the weather or the mechanical issues. He screamed. "Why are you breathing?" Seiichi stood on the wing, looking down. "I could not find the target, sir. The weather—" "Silence!" The officer pulled Seiichi off the wing. He hit the ground hard. Dust filled his mouth. Before he could stand, a boot struck his ribs. Then another. "You are a stain," the officer spat. "You are a stain on this uniform." Seiichi curled up, protecting his head. He didn't fight back. There was no point. In their eyes, he had stolen his own life back from the Emperor. They dragged him to the brig. It wasn't a proper prison cell. It was a storage shed with barred windows. It smelled of mold and old oil. They threw him in and locked the heavy wooden door. Darkness swallowed him. He lay on the dirt floor, his ribs throbbing. He could hear the distant sound of other engines warming up. Other boys going to die. He felt a strange, cold detachment. He took a small notebook from his flight suit pocket. It was forbidden, but he had kept it. He wrote in the dark, feeling the shape of the characters. "I have returned to the world of the living," he wrote, "but I am not welcome here." Days passed. He was given barely enough water to survive. No food. Every time the door opened, he expected the firing squad. He expected to be dragged to the edge of the runway and shot. One guard, a young man who looked no older than 17, brought him a bucket of water. Seiichi looked up at him. "When?" Seiichi asked. The guard looked away. "Soon," the guard whispered. "The commander is waiting for the order from Tokyo." "Why wait?" "Because everyone is waiting," the guard said enigmatically. The bombing raids were getting closer. The ground shook dust from the ceiling of his cell. American B-29s were pounding the cities nearby. The sky at night was lit by the orange glow of burning towns. Seiichi waited for death. He had accepted it in the cockpit. Now he had to accept it in a cage. Then came August 15th. The morning started like any other. Hot, humid, the cicadas buzzing. But the air felt different. The guards were not patrolling. They were gathered around a radio in the command post. Seiichi pressed his ear against the wooden wall of his cell. He heard static. Then, a high, thin voice. Formal, archaic Japanese. It was a voice that no common person had ever heard before. The Emperor. He could not understand all the words. The court language was difficult, but he understood the tone. He understood the sobbing of the men outside. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Seiichi slid down the wall and sat on the dirt. If the war was over, what happened to him? Was he still a traitor? Or was he just a survivor? The door to his cell didn't open that day, or the next. Chaos had overtaken the base. Officers were burning documents. Some were committing suicide. Others were fleeing, changing into civilian clothes to disappear into the countryside. Finally, 3 days later, the door creaked open. It wasn't the angry officer. It wasn't the guard. It was just a mechanic, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. The man looked tired. "You can go," the mechanic said. Seiichi blinked against the sudden sunlight. "Go where?" "Anywhere," the mechanic said. "Go home. There is no army left to kill you." Seiichi walked out of the cell. His uniform was torn and dirty. He walked past the runway. The Zeros were sitting there, silent. Their propellers were still. They would never fly again. He walked to the gate of the base. No one stopped him. No one saluted him. He was just a young man walking down a dusty road. He walked for days to get back to his family. When he arrived, they looked at him with the same shock as the ground crew. They had already placed his photograph on the family altar. They had already mourned him. His mother touched his face, weeping, unable to believe that the ghost had returned to flesh. But survival had a cost. For decades, Seiichi Miyazaki lived with the shadow of that day. He had lived while so many of his friends had turned into balls of fire over the Pacific. He kept his diary. He kept his story. It wasn't until much later, when the pain of the war began to fade into history, that he started to speak. He wanted people to know that the Kamikaze were not mindless machines. They were human beings who were afraid, who cried, and who sometimes, just sometimes, chose life over a meaningless death. According to historical records, hundreds of kamikaze pilots returned to base due to mechanical failure or weather. They were often treated with brutality. Some were reassigned to new planes immediately. Some were beaten. But Seiichi's case was rare. He was marked for execution. Only the atomic bombs and the sudden surrender saved him from the firing squad. He lived a full life. He saw Japan rebuild from the ashes. He saw the world change. But he never forgot the view from that cockpit, the gray ocean, the dropping fuel gauge, and the choice that defined his existence. War creates heroes, we are told. It creates legends of bravery and sacrifice. But it also creates shadows. It creates men who have to live with the complex burden of survival. Seiichi Miyazaki was one of those shadows. He was the kamikaze who lived to tell us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is turn back. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel. We are dedicated to finding the voices that history tried to silence. See you in the next video.